that you will see if you click on the button with the handouts. There are our local officials toolkit that can help your local officials at this time frame when we're looking at doing new maps in the community. There's also a Utah floodplain development permit sample that's there. We also have a Utah Level D model ordinance sample that you can use to help you develop your model ordinance. And we also have the Utah Higher Standard Model Ordinance, and we'll talk a little bit about higher standards and the benefit of putting those in your ordinance for your communities. So just a couple of handouts that we have there, and I think I actually put in a little video there that you can watch at some time that will talk about the benefits of higher standards in communities. So just wanted to let you know that there are a couple of handouts that are available for you. And if you're having problems getting access to the handouts, just put something in the chat and I'll make sure that I get everything out to everybody that was on the webinar today. So give it a couple more minutes, just a couple of people to jump on, and then we'll get going. Here. So I think we were successful on our first chat. That's awesome. So I'm going to turn my camera off just for bandwidth. But we'll get going here on our presentation. Okay, so what I wanted to do is just to kind of talk to you, to start us off on floodplain management, right? Flood hazards and what we do and kind of why we do that. So the first thing I want to introduce you to is the National Flood Insurance Program. This we refer to as the NFIP, and some of you are probably very aware of it, and some of you, this might be new. So I just wanted to kind of let you know that, first of all, the National Flood Insurance Program, we're going to refer to it as the NFIP going forward. That's a voluntary program, and that's based on a mutual agreement between the community and the federal government. So it's not the community and the state that enters into that agreement, that's community and the federal government. And what that happens is when you adopt and enforce your floodplain management regulations, then the federal government gets you eligible for the NFIP insurance. So that's federally backed insurance that's available to all participating communities. When you're not a participating community, you're not eligible for the federal backed insurance. You would have to go to private company for that. And there are private individuals and private companies that do flood insurance, but they're not federally backed, and they might have a little bit different coverage limits and a little bit different eligibility and exclusions with those. So we always show this kind of umbrella. It kind of gives you a basics of, we need to know the risks, right? So this is where we do our map studies and our risk determinations. We need to know the risk in order to regulate to the risk. We have on here the managing the risk, and that's kind of your permitting and your oversight and how your community is going to be developing in the future. And then of course we're looking at ensuring the risk, and that's how individuals can help ensure and mitigate their own properties with the purchase of flood insurance. The state role, that's myself and Mackenzie Goodenough. You might have met Mackenzie when some of you were doing the risk map meetings when the mappings was coming into place for CASH. She's been our community floodplain planner for over a year and worked with Angela Crowther before I came on board. So these are kind of just some things with the state role of what we do. We are going to be helping you with your floodplain management activities. We are the ones that are the technical and specialist assisting local governments. We are the ones that are ensuring compliance. We do work with our communities. We have compliance issues. We're kind of the go-between between the federal government, which would be FEMA, and the community. Kind of the responsibilities with the community, how you join the NFIP was your community put in an application to join the NFIP. They adopted local floodplain management regulations and ordinance to start with. And then in return, obviously the federal government makes the NFIP flood insurance available, like I mentioned. but this also puts you in with providing disaster assistance. So, and also with federal grants. So joining the NFIP wasn't just about the insurance, it also helps with the disaster funding. Local responsibilities, obviously, adopting and enforcing the local ordinances, overseeing development, that's your inspection of development, maintaining your development records, and those are floodplain development permits, remedying any floodplain violations, and we work with you to get those remedied once we find those out. And we're gonna roll over here into our floodplain ordinance 101. So just want to check and see if anybody had any questions at this point before we roll into our floodplain 101, and I'm not seeing anything on the chat here. Alrighty. So floodplain 101 basically is kind of what we're here for, right? Hold on, let me back that up one more slide. All right, so an ordinance is the requirement to determine your flood hazard identification. So the maps that have been provided to your community by the flood insurance administrator, earlier maps in some of your communities might have been done before 1979. When they were done by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, so from HUD. Maps from the 1979 to present are done through Federal Emergency Management Agency, which is our acronym for FEMA. The more detailed your flood map, your new flood map is the more detailed your community floodplain management regulations must be. The National Flood Insurance Program regulations are found in the 44 CFR. They're under Part 60.3, and they further tie the scope of the minimum local regulations to the type of map that the locals are going to be regulating to. So you all received a letter in your community that lets you know that you're going to need to update your floodplain management regulations and ordinances. So sometimes when we are updating ordinances, there are other timeframes that calls for. So when you join the NFIP, you need to have a floodplain ordinance. When FEMA issues new mapping in your community, which is happening right now, you're going to need floodplain ordinances. When there are periodical updates, you want to keep your mapping ordinances up to date with what the community is doing when you're doing buildings. And the community wants to go beyond the National Flood Insurance minimum standards, that helps tailorize to each one of your communities. So communities have unique needs such as agricultural structures, annexations, or you might have historical districts that might require you to update to meet the needs of the community. It would be important to speak to the planning department or work with your city attorney to use a contractor consultant to assist in updating your community ordinance. And I just want to check, I'm looking on my scope here. I think I've got a couple of questions. So first of all, if I don't, I apologize, but Dan, did you have a question that you wanted to come off mic and ask? See if I can get you unmuted here. There you go. Did you have a question, Dan?
No, I'm good. I'm good.
Okay. All right.
Thank you.
And Emily, I also see that that might have a question on my screen. Did you have a question, Emily?
No question. Just there wasn't a place to put my name, so that's where I put it.
Oh, okay. All right. And let's see. I also have a question mark on here on our screen from Tom. Did you have a question, Tom? Maybe not that. Maybe that was that little question on where to put where you're at.
I'm with my microphone there. I was just wondering, I was downloading the handouts, and I was wondering if you had the flood damage prevention ordinance template available in a Word document.
Flood damage prevention. Yeah, we can get that over to you in a document. Will you take a look at that, Mackenzie, and see if we can get that over?
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks for asking. Okay. All right, so let's move on to pause on here. Higher standards. Okay, so we talked a little bit about higher standards, and like I mentioned, there's a video that's in there, and I've also included a sample of the Utah Model Ordinance that has higher standards in there. There are higher standards on that template. They're in red. When your community looks at doing higher standards, they're based on your community's needs. It's not necessary for you to adopt every higher standard that's in the model ordinance. You can take a look at it and say, okay, that higher standard might be something that we want to look at. So some of the ideas are listed here, and I can go over a few of them, but a lot of higher standard communities that are in a community should be considered when you're updating your ordinance. It helps your community be better prepared to recover quicker when we are rebuilding at a higher level. We're able to put in place the regulations that help reduce damage on flooded properties. So things like putting in some information about annexation. There are a lot of communities that I find are growing, developing, right? And so having some information about annexation when you are annexing some property or a section of property, to have that community or that section also adopting your floodplain ordinances. Also, we've talked a little bit about use of best available data. You might have heard this in place. And since your community is getting new floodplain permits, those are the firms that are coming out, you're going to have some really great information, but there might be some information that's out there that might be a little bit more up to date than when the maps are coming out. Because remember, those maps are taking since 2015, and we've just kind of been moving along with those maps. So there might still be some best available data out there that you can use. Some other higher standards that are required, or not required, but something that you can look at is the BFE. And for those of you that might not know what BFE stands for, that's your base flood elevation. And in most floodways, the standard is 1 foot. But if you want to do higher standards in your community, you could maybe make it that you're only going to increase it by a half, right? The 0.5. In non-regulatory floodways. You could require encroachment analysis or a CLOMAR for any development in a zone A. Cumulative substantial improvement and substantial damage. So if you've been on before, if you've listened to us talk about substantial improvement or substantial damage, that's when your building is over 50% of the market value for the building, excluding land. That something might need to be brought up to current floodplain regulations. And this might be something you might want to consider cumulative, maybe put a time frame in there. Let's say maybe 5 years. Some people maybe are going to be improving on a property that is in a special flood hazard area, and maybe they're just going to be under the threshold for every time they apply for a floodplain development permit. So maybe it's 30% of the value for the first time that they're doing it, and maybe it's 15% for the next year that they do it, and then it's another 15 or 20% for the next year. So if you put a cumulative statement in as a higher standard in your floodplain regulations and put a time frame on there, then it is possible that cumulatively you could have those people be building up to the new floodplain regulations. So that's helping people that maybe have an older home built in the 1950s or 1970s that is not up to regulations. Currently, it gives them the opportunity to bring their building up to floodplain regulations. Or if you look at it, it's kind of like when you're doing a building, right? And you're going to come up to code for the building for electrical, or you're going to come up to the code for the building for width of doorways or slopes on stairs. That's the same thing that's happening here with the floodplain developments permits. If you can have somebody build in a way that's going to be more resilient and more safety for them. This is a public safety program, so we are looking at that. Temporary structures, temporary storage, we don't see that a lot sometimes in older ordinances. Maybe this is a time frame to put a window on when temporary structures and temporary storage is in a floodplain, getting permits for those and then putting a time limit on those. And then sometimes we can have something called a non-conversion agreement. We see these a lot back east, but this might be somewhere where somebody has an enclosure that at the time that they're building the enclosure, it's for storage or garage only, where it's below the base flood elevation level, and you can only use that for storage or garage. You don't want them to convert that property once you have permitted it to put in, let's say, a family room or a game room. So non-conversion agreement is something that could be a higher standard you might want to consider with your communities. Again, we talked a little bit about the best available information. You can have that a requirement if you want to put that in your floodplain development. There's a couple of bullet points here of when that might be a good option to do. Jamie Huff is our risk map coordinator here for the state, and she's working on getting a lot of base level engineering for the majority of the states. This would be considered the best available data and can be used to determine base flood elevations. So putting something in the ordinance that requires best available information and when it could be used, especially when you might have the zone A's in the community, is something that can help strengthen your floodplain ordinances and your floodplain management. And some of you might have seen this graph before if you've ever taken the 48 or the 273 or some of our other courses. These are the levels that you'll be looking at when you're determining what your floodplain management needs are going to be. So the appropriate floodplain hazard development permit application form and is going to be determined by the level of floodplain hazard that's shown on your map, okay? So the more detailed the map, the more detailed the floodplain ordinance needs to be. So when we're looking at here, where we've got the largest down here is we've got the no map. This is the 62.3A no map. So this flow chart is kind of as effective as a checklist. It can help you analyze and visualize the tracking of this. This will show you on the next step, more detailed information is being collected. So some of you might already have an ordinance that's a 60.3B. So everything that's required in 60.3A is also required in 60.3B. These are cumulative. You don't just start, let's say at a 60.3C regulation level. It is, you have to include everything in 60.3A, B, and C if you're in a C level. Some of these communities, you guys are moving to a D level ordinance. That means that you are going to have a flood insurance study. That's what the FIS is, abbreviations are for. You are going to have base flood elevation levels. That's in the C level. In the D level, it's now going to include a regulatory floodway. So I want to emphasize here, you need to read and know what your ordinance says and update it where it's needed. So if you are a current community and you only are at level B, and now you have a new flood insurance study that has base flood elevations and a regulatory floodway, you are now going to need to be at a 60.3D level, okay? So I just want to stop right here and see if anybody by the raise of hands, there's a little hand button there, if you have any questions before we move on. This could be a little confusing, and this is where we really are going to have you moving your ordinances to the right level to match your maps. All right, Clay, you've got a question up here. Let me unmute you, Clay. You can ask the question that you have. Are you double muted here? It says on here you're self-muted, so if you want to try one more time and see if you can get yourself off of mute, Clay.
I didn't have a question, sorry.
Okay, I just had a little hand thing on here, so I'll get this down. Okay, let's see if there's anybody else. Nope, we're good. Okay, so let's take a look at our maps. So this one is you might have seen this before, okay? So we're gonna kind of go into our permits. When are floodplain permits needed? We really want to stress, floodplain development permits are needed for any development within a FEMA identified special flood hazard area. This is usually where we run into a little bit of questions when we go out to look at communities and see what they're permitting and go through our community assisted visits, is we might be missing permits because they're not defined as development. So development as defined here, you will see, and I'm just going to read it. Development is defined as any human-made changes or improvements or unimproved real estate, included but not limited to buildings or other structures, mining, dredging, filling, grading, paving, the demolition, excavations, drilling operations. Again, I mentioned storage for either temporary or permanent equipment or materials. Pretty broad. A lot of these things need to be looked at, and then we need to take a look and see if we need to have a floodplain development permit. This just kind of gives you an idea on the map. As you can see, I just got a snapshot here. The regulatory floodway, if you're not familiar with it, you're going to see the red stripes, right? That's going right through this floodway, and it's going to say on here that this is a floodway with a zone AE, right? This is going to be the regulatory floodway. This is your level D ordinance. You'll have a specific area that talks specifically about floodways and what's required in a regulatory floodway. If you haven't seen this before, this is giving you your panel information that's right here. Gives you your effective date. We have in the blue, this is your 1% chance of flooding. So we've got this as a zone AE. And over here, we've got the 0.2. So this is where somebody might say that this is the zone X or the 500 year. We've got the 100 year here. So just to kind of give you a snapshot of what we're looking at. So the permit is the mechanism that you use to evaluate the impacts of activity in your regulatory floodplain. So as we've said before, all activities in regulatory floodplain need a permit. This includes, but is not limited to, again, the buildings or other structures, things that I've mentioned, dredging, grading, fill, mining, excavation, storage of equipment. So the permit helps the applicant and you, the floodplain manager, by clarifying what the applicant needs to submit and determine if a development meets the floodplain regulations established in your ordinance. So when the developed permit, a well-developed permit, makes a floodplain manager's job easier, okay? It should provide the applicant information, a product description or overview, what type of activity is being proposed, Without a completed application, you're not able to make an informed decision to approve or deny a permit. And it's okay as a permitting authority for you to ask an applicant to fill in any missing information. I've seen a couple of permits come through that might not have all the information needed for you to be able to make the determination on whether to approve or deny the permit. Or if you're going to deny the permit, maybe giving that applicant a little bit more information on how they need to build. FEMA provides the technical bulletins, and we can give you a link for those, but there are 11 technical bulletins that can help an applicant in their design and development of what they're going to be doing in the floodway or the flood special flood hazard area, or even in a floodway also. Now, I know we're talking a lot about ordinances, but some of the things that we want you to kind of take an idea or a consideration on. Okay, so you're updating your ordinances. Maybe now's the time to consider a couple of these questions. So I'm going to throw this out here for you. Right now in your community, how does your applicant know that they need to get a floodplain development permit? How are they going to know this? Are they going to be able to know that they need to go onto the National Flood Hazard Layer and take a look and see if they need a permit? Or are they going to be walking into the permit department, the building permit department, and say, I'm going to be building here, what do I need to do? So what processes are in place to trigger a floodplain development permit, right? What processes are you currently using? How are you communicating with the different branches or different agencies or whatever you want to call them, offices, permitting offices? I mean, everybody can put a different acronym in there. How does your floodplain development permit tie into your regular development permit process? Somebody's coming in here and applying for a regular flood development permit. How does the people that you work with, your permitting staff, know to check this area to see if it does require a floodplain development permit? And then how does that information get transferred over to you as a floodplain manager to get a permit into place to either approve or deny? So just some things as you're putting the ordinance together, this is a great opportunity to look at your entire floodplain management and development processes and what you're currently doing and the communications that you're having with your development or with your public works or with your planners or with your city councils. So just some things to kind of consider. Since we're kind of looking at permits, I also wanted, and ordinances, I wanted to also take the time to talk about some of the things that you might see needing to be included with your permits, right? So I hope that some of you have heard of a no-rise certificate, okay, or certifications. I have personally seen some good and some bad no-rise certificates. Some have included the data I need to be able to review, and others have not. So a no-rise certificate for a floodway, again, when you are in that level D ordinance that you need to do, it needs to have both supporting technical data and be signed by a professional engineer. So no-rise analysis needs to reference and use the current effective, okay? Right now, your current effective is not the new maps. Your current effective is what you've got currently. Until your maps go effective in May, that's when you can start using that current effective date. But right now, you're using the current effective that's on there. They need to provide a table of your cross-section plots. If any added cross-sections were used for comparison values to show existing conditions and the model proposed conditions. It would also benefit to have a clear documentation stating the analysis procedures so that you as floodplain development, as floodplain managers can take a look at that no-rise certificate and see if that is a correct no-rise certificate. It needs to be a 0.0. I've seen some come across that'll say a 0.02 in the data, but still somebody has signed off on that saying it's a no rise. It's almost like it's, well, it's kind of a smidgen, it's not really bad, but it's a rise. When we are saying that there's no rise in a regulatory floodway, that means 0.0 or 0.00, right? No rise. So it's hard to be able to take a look at a letter that says this and not have any analysis or documentation that shows how this analysis came about. It's also hard to sometimes look at what they provide for you, and I'm not an engineer. I need to have clear, defined table that shows me these are the cross sections, these are the plots that were used, these are the cross sections that were added so that they could do the model, and then this is what the actual comparison values are going to show. And it's all right for you as floodplain managers to ask for that information when somebody is giving you or developing the no rise certificate and giving that to you. Okay. Dan, you have your hand up. So I'm going to try and unmute you and see if you have a question.
I got mine unmuted now.
Okay.
Say you have a parcel or a development that's come in, and the floodplain map only goes through a small portion of that parcel, and yet all of the development's happening on the other end of that same parcel. Would you still require, or would you recommend getting a study and a permit, floodplain permit for that?
So we've got a parcel, and some of the floodplain is touching the parcel.
Yeah,
Is
just
it
goes through a
touching
corner
the
of it.
structure?
No. Let's say all of this development structure's outside of the floodplain.
Then
And yet,
that's great. That's smart development, because you could take a look at parcels that come in for review, and by maybe adjusting a little bit, you are removing it from the special flood hazard area, and you would not need to get that permitted. If it's not in the special flood hazard area, it does not require a permit. So by moving it maybe a couple of feet, some people
Okay.
can save themselves having to do the floodplain development permit, or having to, let's say, elevate or install, flood vents, right? So to answer your question, no, if it's not touching the structure, you would not need to permit.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, good question. And I think that's also goes to when we can talk to developers that, are looking, if they're aware of that, maybe they can tweak their plans a little bit, right? And maybe make some open space instead of putting a structure there, move the structure somewhere else. So good question, great question. Let's see, Matthew, looks like you have a question too. Did you want to unmute yourself?
Can you hear me? I think I'm unmuted.
You are unmuted.
My question on this is that I struggle a little bit on this one, because this is if there's a defined floodway, but if you're just in the A zone and someone's working in, what you would consider a floodway, even though it's not calculated on your maps, do you need to require no rise in these situations, or how do you handle that in an A zone that doesn't have defined floodways?
So what I would recommend on when the A zone is where we go back to using best available data, because A zones are just these approximate zones. We just do not have the information basically to say this is the BFE. Somebody's gonna have to develop those BFEs, right? So that's where the best available information is coming into. If it's in a floodway that is not regulated, then they're still going to need to do analysis on there. Basically, when you have that zone A, it's that you guys just don't have a detailed study to regulate. You're going to have the developer provide that detailed study. So they're going to have to go through those steps. They're going to have to determine the base flood elevations. If they're in a floodway, they're still going to believe, and Heidi is on here with FEMA. Heidi, correct me if I'm wrong. Can't they go up to a 1 foot rise in a non-regulatory floodway as long as it's not, it's cumulative over that time frame? Am I correct in that? And I'm not seeing Heidi put that answer for me.
So Mike, I guess putting a simple project, say someone wants to come in and do a culvert in an A zone, would this, if I made them go through all this, would this be above and beyond the CFR standards in an A zone? Or would this be like the higher community standards if they had to come in and provide something that they weren't raising that more than a foot?
Well, they have to show you they're not going to raise it more than a foot.
But am I covered under this one? I guess that's where when we're redoing our ordinance, whether we can put that in there, is that considered above and beyond the
No,
CFR codes? Because in the steps, if it's in an A zone, then they only have those certain CFR requirements, but now they're in it's not a floodway defined on a firm map, and it doesn't have BFEs, but a culvert project, your common sense would tell you that's in a floodway. So then can I increase those to make them go through all the same stuff that they would if it was on the map? Or am I going to get in trouble by saying, oh, this is above and beyond, this is not what FEMA requires? Or do I need to have that in my code?
Oh, okay. So first of all, you would never get in trouble if you go above and beyond. So if FEMA says you just need to make sure that they're not going to increase it over a foot, you can require them to still do the CLOMAR. You could require them, FEMA wouldn't get in trouble, you wouldn't get in trouble with FEMA by saying, hey, you can only go over a half of a foot. So the trouble thing, it wouldn't, if you're going to go higher standards, FEMA's not going to frown on that. FEMA only is going to make sure that you are required to do the minimum standards. And I think that the floodway is going to be 60.3A10 is going to talk about non-regulatory floodways and what you need to do in a non-regulatory floodway. So as long as you're following the CFRs, and you have to be following the CFRs in the ordinance, and you would start out with level A with the CFRs, and then you would be looking at, so here you'd be looking at no 60.3B, I think has also got the no regulatory floodways. Also 60.3C will also talk about non-regulatory floodways. But let me get the exact language for you, Matt, and then I will get that sent over for you on exactly the minimum that's needed in a floodway when it's not defined, when it's not regulatory. Would that be helpful?
That'd be very helpful. Thank you.
I'll do that. Okay. Mackenzie, write that down. Oh, Mackenzie's got her hand up. She might have been looking at it while I was flipping around with things. So Mackenzie, let's unmute you, see if you had that.
Okay, can you hear me?
I can hear you.
Okay, so it's under 60.3 C10.
Okay.
And it just says require until a regulatory floodway is designated that no new construction, substantial improvement, or other development, including fill, shall be permitted. It says unless it's demonstrated that the cumulative effect of the proposed development when combined with all other existing and anticipated development will not increase the water surface elevation of the base flood more than 1 foot at any point in the community. So that's throughout your entire community. You can't increase the base flood elevation more than a foot with that development unless if you do not have a floodway. If that helps at all.
And that's what we'll send over to you, Matt, just to,
Yep.
to kind clarify on that. And then again, it's your community. You can put in there that you're requiring them to do a CLOMAR, or you're requiring them to somehow show you that they're not going to rise that level more than a foot cumulatively in the community. Or again, if you want to do the higher standards, you could say you're not going to rise it more than a half of a foot. But FEMA will require the 1 foot in a non-regulatory floodway.
And that's good information. I appreciate that. I wrote that down. If you guys want to send me something, that'd be great.
You bet.
And then I'll dive in a little more instead of, delaying this presentation any further, just to see how we get from B to C in the ordinance and in the CFR stuff, because the specific one that you guys quoted me was out of C. And so somehow you got to get out of B to C to have that one. And if our ordinance doesn't require you to go do a BFE or anything like that, then we need to make sure we're covered that so we can get from the B step to the C step. So I appreciate it. Thank you.
And Matt, were you putting the note or in the chat what community you're with so that we can look and see what level you're moving to?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thanks. All righty. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about those CLOMARs right here, right? It's not a permit. CLOMAR is not a permit. So the CLOMAR is a letter from FEMA commenting on whether a proposed project, if built as proposed, would meet the minimum NFIP standards. A CLOMAR might be obtained by a developer who is modifying a floodplain through the use of constructed drainage, okay? If FEMA approves the CLOMAR, the developer can be reasonably sure that the LOMAR, which, so we've got the conditional, that's the CLOMAR's conditional, then they're gonna have to apply for that LOMAR, so they can be reasonably sure that the LOMAR upon completion, if it's completed as they designed it, will also be approved. Take into time and consideration when you're talking to developers that CLOMARs take time to process, and they will likely always have a request for additional information. See that all the time. They put in the information and the request for the CLOMAR. There is a fee for the CLOMAR, and there is a great link on the FEMA website that breaks down CLOMARs, LOMARs, and LOMAs, and the process and the fees for it. And we can share that link with you. But it does take time. This can take up to 6 months, and as they're going back and forth and asking for additional information, it can extend that out. So if they've done a CLOMAR to begin with, we're kind of told by FEMA that the LOMAR, which is the actual letter of map revision, will be proved a little bit easier. So, and you do need to make sure that anytime you do a CLOMAR, it must be followed by a LOMAR, because that's actually going to change the map, okay? Now, the letter of map revisions, again, that's the LOMAR, so it revises the effective flood insurance rate maps, and it also the flood insurance studies. So it's going to show that change in base flood elevation in the special flood hazard area and the regulatory floodways. So generally, a LOMAR is used for multi-lot projects or large scale changes to the floodway. Okay, it can only be, the LOMAR is based on the as-built or the existing conditions. Okay. Now, we've talked a lot about what these changes are going to be happening in the community. And as Jamie Huff has been going through the risk map process, there have been lots of community meetings. They showed preliminary maps. They have gone through a number of steps, appeals, timeframes, and some of the community might be aware of it. Some of the community might not. So these are some social media graphics that we can share with you that you can look at, maybe doing some outreach with your community, just kind of stating that the basics, flooding is the most common disaster in the US. it causes major damage that impacts the whole community to just impacting just a few people. So you have isolated flooding, that's just impacting a few people. But regardless of the number of properties involved, to each individual, it's a major financial hardship. So as community officials, part of your role involves communicating with people in your community regarding this flood risk. So ultimately understanding their flood risk, and they're going to be showing new flood risk now with these new maps, and then taking action can help create a more resilient community, and working with your community leaders, which is the toolkit that we've provided in the handouts, can help them provide effective messaging to help get the people on the same page. Okay, we've got new maps, there's new risk, we want you to be aware of it. So these social media graphics can be found on the floodsmart.gov website. They're under the resource library, and they are available in both English and Spanish, and you can pull them for Facebooks or Twitter accounts, just to help you get that information out if your community has their own Facebook page, or maybe you've got a we call them PIOs, but this public information officer with your community that can help you put together maybe a little campaign to get this information out. So as a review here for cash, the maps and the flood studies must be adopted prior to May 9th. Okay, that's your date. If the community does not adopt the new flood maps and the flood study by May 9th, the community will be sanctioned. They're sanctioned from the NFIP. That means that there will be letters that will go out to all insurance holders, policy holders with the NFIP saying the community has been sanctioned. It also stops anybody from purchasing new insurance, and when they have a federally backed mortgage and they have a home in the special flood hazard area, they are required to have insurance. It will prevent them from getting the federally backed insurance. Won't prevent them from getting the private insurance, but it will prevent them from getting the NFIP. So it will also, if the community is sanctioned, it will also tie up financial assistance for any acquisition or construction purposes, including in some cases, federal disaster assistance might not be available in these communities. So when you're thinking about this and the timing, you need to build in extra time to get your maps and ordinances updated and adopted. Some communities have a 30-day public notice period required by your community leaders for any ordinance updates. So planning for this and any community council meetings needs to be taken into consideration on your timing when you're doing this. So it's important to keep your community informed of these changes so that you guys can work together on a timing when you can get these ordinances updated, get them to your community council, getting them approved. And then if you've got that 30-day public notice period, you need to make sure that's all built into your time frame to make sure you get everything done by that May 9th date. So I am going to, before we go to our, well, we'll go to the questions here. So I like this one. I stole this off of Matt Betty. If you know Matt Betty, he had this on his slide, and I love it. It's got a tent, right? Building the floodplain is like pitching your tent on a highway when there are no cars coming, right? We just don't know. There's a risk that's there. It's a possibility that that's going to happen. So I want to just open it up right now. We've got a couple of minutes just for some questions, and then I've got one more poll that I want to pull through here for you. So question-wise, hand raised. Matt, I still got your hand raised on here. I don't know if I didn't lower it for you. Did you have another question? Nope, you lowered that.
Yep.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Mackenzie, you have your hand up also. Is there something that you would like to interject as our planner? See if she can get herself off mute.
Nope, I'm good. Sorry, I forgot to lower my hand as well.
That's okay, and I forgot to take it off also, so we're all good. I've got a couple of question marks on a couple of people's names, but I don't know if those are just stuck. So if you have a question, let's use the hand thing, and then I can see that on there. And in the meantime, I'm going to roll out the second poll, give you time to think about it. And we'll launch this one here. So yeah, this is asking, yeah, will you be the one to update your floodplain ordinances? If you are not, we'd be happy to get information out and have conversations with somebody that is. We'd be happy to do conference calls if you need to do that. Mackenzie and myself are here to help you get through this process. So almost done with our questions that are here. So looks like a couple of you might have put no on there, that you are not the one that's updating your floodplain ordinances. Again, if you want to give our contact information to those that might be updating that, we would be happy to share information with you, with them, with any of the handouts. I would put our team contact information here. So you've got our floodplain management, that's myself, Tracy Harrison, and Mackenzie. The risk map coordinator is Jamie Huff, and Holly Strand is our communication specialist. And our guru from FEMA, that's Heidi Carlin. She's been working with the floodplain remapping that we've been doing in Cache. Oh, you can't see it? Oh, thanks, Mackenzie. Mackenzie says we still got the pull up, so pardon me, let me get that out of there. There we go. There's our contact information. Tell you this, sometimes these new web platforms are kind of fun. What? The next one is still? Oh, that's the one.
We're seeing Matt's.
I'll check it again. Sorry about that, guys. So I didn't see that there were any questions on here that was remaining. I am going to send a poll out, or excuse me, a survey that's going to go out for this presentation. And I would so enjoy constructive criticism. This is the first time I've done the presentation for the ordinances. Again, I mentioned I was new coming in here in September. My background was risk map prior to this, and then worked a little stint with FEMA before coming back to the state. I grew up here in Utah, and I'm happy to be back. But I would be grateful if you can send us out some constructive criticism, because we do have another majority of communities that are going to be in the same situation with new maps and being able to update their ordinances, and any information that you can provide for me to make this a better presentation, I would be greatly appreciated. So with that, again, we'll send out the handouts. For those of you that had some questions on some specifics, we'll send that out to you. Please don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Mackenzie if you have any other questions. And we'll be in touch with you as you're working through this. If you would like to send a draft version of your floodplain ordinance before you even get it up to the city council or your community council, we would be happy to review that. And actually, we would strongly suggest that. We'd hate for you to go through and put the ordinance all together and then get it approved through the council, and then when it comes over to us and FEMA ultimately to review, if you've missed some particular information that's required and have to go back to the council, we just don't want to have that happen. So I've done this with a couple of other communities on the FEMA side with doing the ordinance reviews. I'd be really happy to help any of you to do that. If you just want to send me, like I say, the draft, we'll give you it a quick turnaround, because I know this is a time crunch, and provide you with any other information. So unless anybody has any other questions, I'm just going to give you a couple of minutes back. Oh, Dan, I've got your hand up here. Did you have a question? Let me get you unmuted. There you go.
Yes, I just wanted to throw out a hypothetical here.
Sure.
To see if it'll help answer my question.
Okay.
Say you're on a floodway, and it's a popular one. So let's assume there's a whole bunch of developments trying to come in, and they each do a study and say, well, we're going to raise the base flood, the BFE, a half a foot. But as it develops over the next few years, 5 of them sequentially have raised it a half a foot. It's possible for that base flood elevation to be raised 2.5 feet.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah, so that's going to be really kind of tricky, and it's also going to be with maybe having those communications. So let's say you do have somebody that's developing, I don't know, let's say Ivory Homes is developing on one end of it, and then you've got, I don't know, Gardner Homes or Grant, is it Gardner, another home developer that's developing somewhere else. And in the middle of that, let's say your own community is going to be doing some public works development. So I would say that it would be a good way of trying to get all of those developers together. Maybe they can share in the information that they're collecting, utilizing the exact same model. So you want to make sure that anytime anybody is doing any type of these studies, that they are actually tying it into the FEMA study. Sometimes I've seen where they've taken off and done their own study and they didn't tie it in anywhere, and we usually run into some problems that way. So at least having them start with the same study and the same like benchmarks to try and keep the numbers consistent. Again, when you're put this proposal, when you're asking this question, obviously I'm thinking it's a non-regulatory floodway that's allowing that bit of a rise. So they're going to have to tie into each one of the models that's being done. So it's going to be a lot of collaboration and timing. If somebody is getting a model done quicker, it might have that communication saying, hey, Ivory Homes has got their models already completed. And because we have this in our ordinance, it would be beneficial for you to tie into that, because we cannot have over that 1 foot rise cumulative in this area. So, and then if they're starting to bump up on theirs, right, they're starting to get a little bit higher, then they're going to have to redesign a little bit to bring those numbers back down. So it is tricky. I haven't had it happen too many times that I've run into, but it's a question that I think what I'll do for you, Dan, is I'll reach out to Tom Burney. He is with FEMA Region 8. He's been doing floodplain management like this for, I think, over 25 years. And maybe I'll see if I can get, if you're interested, maybe have a conversation with him if you think, I know you say it's hypothetical, but if you think that that's something that might really happen in the community, I'd be happy to get him on the phone and maybe we can kind of powwow on best practices that he's seen with other states or other floodplain permits and in communities, if you'd be interested in that.
Yeah, okay. And kind of a spin-off question on that, does FEMA have a repository for the data and information? Say Ivory Homes came in and they did a study, did the development, and it raised maybe a half of a foot, but 2 or 3 years later, somebody else comes in and you know, the comment, or I think one of your earlier slides said FEMA doesn't update, you know, they don't continually update those maps. And so that information, is it, you know, behooving to the community to keep those records and say, oh, you're now developing 3 years after Ivory Homes was, here's the new model data because it's been updated? Or does FEMA have that repository of data and information?
Yes, so let's look at a couple of things. So let's say that they did the route where they first of all did the Clomar, because we've got some development. In fact, if you were on the call with Harriman, we did a lunch and learn with Jonathan Bowers and Harriman just with January, right? So his developer went in first of all and they did the Clomar. So that Clomar is getting information in. Now, it hasn't flipped over to a LOMAR. The LOMAR would have the study and would be available on the map depository, right? And now the LOMAR is where you would regulate to. So then you're using that study. So if, let's say, Ivory Homes got all theirs in and they got the LOMAR done first, and then somebody was going to tie in, then they would tie into the Ivory Home, which is already with FEMA in the map depository, and all the modeling that's already there. So they could tie directly into Ivory Homes. So it's just a matter of timing. And for the community, that's where you want them to complete and get LOMARs done. Even if they didn't get the conditional letter of map revision, which is just very, very helpful, and they just went straight in and did the LOMAR is what's going to be put with the map repository. So that's what everything's going to start to be based off of.
Okay, super.
You'll find them. Yeah, so that information is available to another developer that comes in, and you could tell them, okay, this is where it's at. There's a LOMAR. So when they pull up the National Flood Hazard Layer, you can click on where the LOMARs are. You can see, oh, this little stream, this little section of mileage of stream has got a LOMAR to it. And that's where you're going to start tying in for the next development.
All right. Thank you.
And these are all great questions. And we are, since you're all on the phone with me and I have a captive audience, we are trying to, we do a lunch and learn every single month. And we're trying to get ideas to help floodplain managers with some of these questions that come up, and we'll get some specialists to come on and talk about things that they've seen in best practices. So we asked for, there was a survey that went out for lunch and learn survey that Mackenzie sent out so that we could improve our lunch and learn trainings, and this would be a great one to do. So if you guys think of things like this, like what about these situations, or I'd like to learn more about this, please, please, please let me know, because I'm trying to build on the questions that you guys have to, because you're not the only one that has this question. I mean, there's other floodplain developers or contractors that have run into the same thing. And I'd love to be able to do trainings that we can envelop past lessons learned and best practices for everybody. So appreciate you sharing that comment. Was there anybody else?
Is that lunch and learn open to general folks or
yes.
floodplain managers to come to, or what's the schedule on
there, emergency managers on there, and Dan, if I don't have you on there, that's my bad, 'cause I know you've reached out to me before, so we can send you the sign up on those. So
okay,
we do
great.
trainings, we do our newsletter that way, and the lunch and learn. I'd be happy to put that out there. And again, any information you guys can give us on what you want, I want to be here to provide that for you.
That would be great. Thank you.
Okay. All right. So I appreciate all the participation, the great questions that were asked. Again, you have our contact information if you have other questions or need additional support. Again, thank you so much for being patient with me as I'm going through my first little webinar here. And we'll just follow up with that survey that comes out. I'll just give you the rest of your day back. I hope you have a good one and stay safe out there in that snow.